Hello, everybody. In today's class, we're going to talk about the disaster psychology of a pandemic, specifically COVID-19. Before we do that, let's set the scene a little bit to understand the principles or the basics of what we need to do, in order to understand the disaster psychology of pandemics. Whenever we discuss disaster psychology, there's at least three players, at least three stakeholders that have to be considered. First, and perhaps foremost, is the population. This is the client. In every disaster risk reduction plan we are designing, the client has to be the population. If we don't understand the way people are aware to the risks, the way they perceive the risk, the way they behave in face of the risk, the level of trust they have in other stakeholders, other players, we will never ever be successful in making a good and effective disaster risk reduction plan. So knowing the population is of crucial importance. But at the same time, it's also very important to understand the other two pieces, the decision makers and the media. In terms of the decision makers, while their decisions affect the population, they are also people. They are also subjected to different cognitions, to different stressors, to different senses of responsibility and accountability. They also make their decisions under a lot of uncertainty. All of those factors influence the way they make their decisions and ultimately the way those decisions interact with the population. And on the other side, the media, which is the mediator between the decision makers and the population, they also play a crucial role because they also comprise of people, and the decision making there is made by people. Some of the decisions the media is making are not always in the best interest of the public. We like to view the media as the democracy watchdogs, but actually what their main initiative or the main motivator, is actually to sell commercials. They have to sustain themselves by making money. If they have to sustain themselves by making money, they have to sell commercials. If they want to sell commercials, then perhaps they need to make the titles a little bit bigger than they are, maybe focus on marginal things that are covered disproportionately to their magnitude in actuality. Fake news comes into play. How much of the information we are provided is actually true and how much of it is blown out of proportion or is completely misrepresenting the truth. All of these are super important to understand when talking about disaster psychology. And specifically with COVID-19, it's important to understand the settings of how we got into the disaster or the situation in order to understand the way people behave during the pandemic and possibly any future pandemic if we follow suit on those same errors and mistakes. So first thing we need to know about COVID-19 is when it began, most people, to some extent also today, viewed it as an existential threat. Meaning that they view this new disease, unknown disease, which there's a lot of hidden truth about it that are yet to be discovered. Does it kill very much? Does it make you sick very much? Are young people at the same risk as older people? All of these things are more understood now than they were before, but even nowadays there's a lot of uncertainty about it. And all of this uncertainty and the fact that there's a new disease and we don't know much about it besides the fact that it's spreading around the world, create this feeling that it's an existential threat. It taps into the terror management theory by arousing the awareness, the mortality salience, and it also taps into the fight, flight, freeze mode that many people enter to when they think there's an existential threat on their well-being. All the psychology of people is reduced to a very low level of thinking during an existential threat. It's a fight, flight, freeze mode. Tell me what I need to do and I'll do it in order to survive. And they look up to the government, they look up to the leaders to tell them what to do. If you think that in that sense people are much different than sheep, well, We are not. Whenever there's an existential threat, the most basic thinking and the primal instincts get into action, and we are just trying to find a way to survive whatever threat is out there. The thing is, many governments, especially here in Israel, but many governments chose the tactic of fear appeal as a major component of their risk communication. What that means, or what that suggests, is that governments used fear tactics in order to get people to be very obedient with health regulations. They scared them and they frightened them in order to ensure that the public meets the regulation, the public health regulation, for example, for self-quarantine, for lockdown, for wearing masks, etc. When this is at the beginning of the pandemic, it's actually a very good strategy, a very effective one, because as I said, people are very afraid and they look up to the government to tell them what to do. And if they're being told, look, this is a real existential threat and you should be afraid and listen to us, that's what they do. And that's why the first wave around the world was a very small one, and streets were empty and people were very, very obedient in terms of maintaining the public health regulation. The problem is that this strategy is very short-lived. In the long term, as soon as the fog of war dissipates and people begin to compare between the doomsday scenario and what actually happened, that's when they lose trust. And losing trust is a major obstacle in managing disasters. If you no longer have public trust, it becomes a super challenging, not to say impossible, task for decision makers, governments to manage disasters. Couple that with the fact that many of the communications were confused, conflicting. There was lack of coherence in terms of some of the communication making no sense. Why is it okay to go to run next to the beach, but you cannot stay at the beach? Why is it okay for a huge store to open up, but a small store cannot open up? Why can those huge stores now get new merchandise that they don't regularly sell and take out of business the small businesses, etc., etc.? And selective enforcement, or what perceived to be selective enforcement. For example, here in Israel, there was a perception that ultra-Orthodox are not being as enforced as the general population, or the Arabic section not being as enforced as the others. So putting them all together, you get what is called unwanted behavior. Some politicians refer to this as lack of discipline by the public. It's not lack of discipline. It's actually non-rational behavior derived from non-rational management. And that's precisely what we want to avoid. Unwanted behavior is precisely what we want to avoid when managing different disasters and emergencies. So let's dive into some of the parts I just mentioned, starting off with the fear appeal. Fear appeal, if you ask me for the bottom line, I think it's the worst tactic governments can use in any type of emergencies and disasters. I don't even think that a little fear appeal is good. I can understand why it's needed in some circumstances, because if there's a group of people which is, very much disobedient, then you have to make sure that you can convey the message that laws will be enforced, and you do that through some fear tactics. But in general, using fear in order to get people to be persuaded or engaged in wanted behavior has almost never proven itself in health behavior. Even if you think about smoking and all of those ads that are supposedly trying to frighten smokers, all of those gruesome pictures on packs of cigarettes, I don't know how many of those really changed the minds of people and persuaded them from smoking. And if they did, it was very marginal. I want you to take a look at two risk communication ads that were run during the COVID-19 outbreak here in Israel. The first one is using what I'm calling fear appeal or fear tactics. I want you to pay attention to the sound, to the color scheme, to the feeling. Okay, bear in mind this is an ad from early on in the disease where there was a concern that the disease might be spreading also from surfaces, which we now know to be false, but back then people weren't really sure about this. So even the optimistic message at the end, together we will win and defeat the corona, is too late. It's following a message which is the sound of the clock ticking, the red sounds, the dramatic music, and also the misconceptions about how disease spread, even if they spread through surfaces. I mean, your arm doesn't get contaminated, right? It's just if you touch your face, there's a lot of misconceptions in this video, and it's also using a lot of fear tactics. And this is the kind of risk communication I'm talking about, which is, in my opinion, very not effective in creating people to behave the way that you want them to behave. So what can be done? There is to be done. There's a different way of doing risk communication, which is effective and which is capable of persuading people and engaging people in wanted behavior. At some point during the disease, during the pandemic, I think toward the second wave, the Homefront Command was tasked with the mission of stopping the spread of the disease by investigating people that have been confirmed with COVID-19 and asking them who they've been in contact with in order to break the chains of infections. And so the Homefront Command was calling people and asking them, so who did you come in contact with? And they saw that many people, up to 25% actually, said that they didn't come in contact with anyone. Okay, just think about what this means. And then they issued this risk communication campaign, and I want you to pay attention. It's in Hebrew and you have subtitles, but I want you to pay attention not only to the content, but also to the music and the atmosphere and the messages, the overall messages.
רק שתדעו שאני רוצה לדעת.
תכלס גם אני. כולם פה. אני חייבת לדעת. אנחנו באמת צריכים לדעת.
לא רק בשבילי, וגם בשבילו. מגיע להם לדעת. ובחנתם כמאומתים לקורונה? בתשאול האפידמיולוגי הקפידו למסור פרטים מלאים על האנשים שפגשתם, ויחד נקטע את שרשרת ההדבקה. עוד פרטים בפורטל החירום הלאומי, ובמוקד הטלפוני 104.
So what this ad is trying to do, besides the fact that the music is much more upbeat and the overall messages of optimism and shared future and communality, etc., what it's trying to do is to change the norm. The fact that a quarter of the people, when asked who they came in contact with, said nobody, suggests that the norm is if you snitch on other people, you are a bad guy. Okay, you are actually dooming them to self-quarantine, and that's a really bad thing to do, and you should lie in this investigation because that is what other people expect of you. That's the norm. And this ad is trying to change the norm, is saying the people deserve to know, they should know, they deserve to know. So it's a matter of trying to break the cycle of reframing the norm. And it was successful. You're seeing here the 23% of people saying no contacts reported on the 26th of October, when before this ad was running. And less than a month later, this figure dropped to 2%. So there is a way of doing risk communication correctly. And if you want the tips for effective risk communication, in my opinion, don't use fear appeal. If you have to use fear appeal, have it as moderate as possible and only for a reasonable target. Instead, try to focus the risk communication on optimism and empowerment. Focus on the individual, but use the individual sets of norms and morals in order to make them part of a bigger group. It's about sharing. It's about taking care of other people. When you are, for example, with masks. So the surgical mask, if you think about this for a second, the original intent and use of surgical mask is to protect the patient from the medical team, right? So the patient lying on the operating table is at risk because their tissues are being opened up, and if the doctors will spit into their tissues, they might contaminate them. So doctors and nurses use the surgical mask to protect the patient from them. This kind of mask is actually not intended to protect the person wearing the mask from outside threats. It does provide some protection, better than nothing, but it's not intended for it. So just think about this. If from the beginning the use of masks would have been framed as the normative thing to do in order to safeguard other people. You are wearing the mask because you care about other people's. You are wearing the mask because you want to avoid other people from getting contaminated, which is much the case in Eastern Asia. In Japan and other places, when people are sick, they go out wearing a mask because the norm there is that you should protect other people from your disease. And it's possible. You just need to change the way you perceive risk communication to a more optimistic and empowerment messages rather than just fear appeal. Let's talk about other human behaviors in the context of a pandemic. Let's talk about panic buying. Panic buying has come as a huge surprise to many people in the beginning of the outbreak. Many people were flocking to the supermarkets to get stuff because they heard about lockdowns, they heard about self-isolation. There is an existential threat out there. They're not sure what's going to happen, so they go and buy some food and water. But that's not the only things, not just food and water that was being bought. Other types of products were being bought that didn't make much sense. For example, one of them was toilet paper. Why toilet paper? This is not a gastrointestinal disease. You're not going to, if you get COVID-19, it's not like you're sitting on the toilet 24/7. That's not the kind of disease we're talking about. So why toilet paper? There are different explanations and different possible answers to that. One, you can even think about it as Freudian psychology and the toilet paper being linked to control. For anal personality and all of those sort of things. People wanting to regain control of their life are seeking items that are showing them that they will be able to regain control over their lives, such as toilet paper. But it actually can also be explained by just the simple need of human beings to make sense of the world. So things are tumbling down around them. Life as they know it changed very dramatically and very rapidly. They don't know what to expect. They are afraid that the most basic things that they have grown accustomed to are going to change. And they say to themselves, nobody is going to get me wiping my behind with something other than a toilet paper. I'm going to make sure that the basics that I need in order to maintain my humanity and my dignity are preserved, right? So people need the basics. Whenever there's such an incident of existential threat, the psychology of people is reduced to the basic. What is the basic things I need? And this kind of panic buying could have been anticipated if the way people perceive risks and react to disaster risk cues would have been taken into consideration. The same goes for humor. The more the existential threat and the fear around it are bigger, the more the need for humor to counteract and to subdue the fear of death that is arising out of those circumstances, right? So there was a lot of need for and a lot of use of humor during the COVID-19 pandemic. And at first, it seems like a very nice relief. So yeah, sure, go ahead, make fun of this. And if on the way it makes you feel better, then great. But we also need to think about the adverse consequences of using too much humor to counteract too much fear. At some point, too much humor can cause the situation to become ridiculous. And if the situation is perceived to be ridiculous, then that might suggest to people that it should be deemed as ridiculous. So there isn't really a pandemic. It's all just funs and giggles. It's, I don't know, April Fool's kind of thing that goes on year round, right? So there are adverse consequences to using too much humor. If you use too much fear at the beginning, you will have this counter force in the form of humor. And if there's too much humor surrounding the disaster, you might get people to be indifferent to the risk and perceive the risk to be ridiculous. Public trust. Public trust is super, super important. We discussed this before, but if you want to get people to engage in wanted behavior, the first thing you have to do is gain their trust. When you lose their trust, you lose the effective way of managing the way people behave. What you're seeing here are data from 4 points during the COVID-19 outbreak. February 2020 was before the outbreak actually began here in Israel. March was the peak of the first wave. August was the second wave, and January was the fourth wave, divided and broken down into the Jewish ultra-Orthodox in black, Jewish other in blue, and Arab, non-Jewish but mostly Arab in red. And what is most striking about this shape of curve is that it looks like an L-shaped curve. What does that mean? It means that at the beginning there's a relatively high level of trust in the Ministry of Health, right? Maybe not as much in the general population, but among the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs is relatively high. Then when the pandemic starts and people are very much attentive to what the government has to say because they are very much afraid, you see the spike. People gain more trust in the government. They say, oh my God, I'm super afraid now. Please let me know what to do. And about 75 to 80% of people say they trust the government and the Ministry of Health very much. But then as the fog of war dissipates, as I told you before, you see the break in the levels of trust going all the way down to as little as 30% levels of trust. And it doesn't go up really. You see here among the Arab population, it does go a little bit up. It could be a genuine finding. It also could be to the fact that the internet survey we use is not as good as in representing the Arab population as it is in representing the Jewish population. But anyways, it's very clear that the trust doesn't go back as rapidly as we would want it or expect it. The break here in trust is very prominent, and when you lose public trust, it becomes very, very difficult to manage the situation. If people don't believe you, then what is there for you to do? In terms of economical motivators, super important in the context of disasters that are chronic or become chronic. At some point during the COVID-19 outbreak, this was no longer just a public health crisis. It became an economical crisis very rapidly because businesses were shut down for a long period of time and people were losing their livelihood. Losing a livelihood for people is an existential threat, no less than a virus, than a spread of a virus. This is something that has to be understood by policymakers. People don't just perceive the risk of contagious diseases as very high. They also perceive the risk of losing their livelihood as very high. And if you don't take that into consideration, then you might see them acting out in a way which doesn't fit with what you want them to do. If they think that they should now go out and open their businesses, despite of the fact that their businesses should be closed, then you are losing both battles, the one against the virus and the one against the economic depression, right? Because neither is going to benefit from people losing trust in the government and driving into anarchy, right? What you're seeing here in this chart is actually the results, again, on the 4 time points. When we ask people, are you going to comply with self-isolation decree should you be deemed that you have to go into self-isolation, would you comply with this? Depending on whether or not you'll be compensated for lost wages or not compensated. So the full line here in blue is the compliance rate for people if we assume that they will be compensated for lost wages. And you see the Israeli public is relatively compliant, 90 to 95% throughout the pandemic say, I am willing to comply with the self-isolation decree as long as the government pays me for lost wages, okay? Here on the bottom with the full lines, you have people saying no and people saying I don't know and maybe, okay? Again, assuming that they are compensated. And the dotted lines is the compliance rate when the compensation for lost wages is not assumed. So when people are told, in a circumstance where you will not be compensated for lost wages, will you comply with the self-isolation decree? And you see the drop. It drops from 90 to around 50. At the peak of trust, it goes down from 95 to 70, and then it continues to go down with an increased number of people saying no and maybe, all right? And that's a very important thing to note about the way people react during chronic threats. It's not just the one single threat that should be taken into consideration. It's the other implications, the long-term implications of sustaining that threat that people also perceive to be their own threats. And if you want a picture that summarizes what I just made, the point I just made is this one. It's a shop somewhere in Israel with this sign here that says, I'm a law-abiding person, but I decided to become an offender in order to survive, right? I'm opening my store despite the fact that I'm not allowed to because I have to survive, okay? Survive, not just surviving the disease, surviving the economical burden. And to wrap up in terms of the effects, the COVID-19 effects, there were also a lot of social effects. For example, as is the case with terrorism here in Israel, at some point the threat became chronic, right? It became part of our daily life. And the best way to observe the threat becoming part of daily life is the normalization of the threat. If in terrorism it comes into play in terms of people still using buses and going to coffee shops and not changing their daily lives because they got accustomed and used to terrorism being around them, during COVID-19 it can take the shape, for example, of masks fashion, right? So now we have masks in different colors and style, and people perhaps adapt and adjust their mask to what they're wearing. So it becomes part of their life. It's just, okay, so there's a disease out there. I'm getting accustomed to it. I now know I have to live next to it side by side. So I'm just making sense out of it as I'm going along. This is a dramatically different stage psychologically and sociologically speaking from the first part of the pandemic. When people grow accustomed to the threat, to the pandemic in this case, or any other threat, their psychology changes very dramatically. And you cannot use the same tools of risk communication when people have the threat normalized. That won't work. Now they know that the threat is there. They've learned how to live with it, at least in their own impression. They make sense of it. They know they made their own rules as to what they should and shouldn't do because they've learned from their own experience that if I stay 2 meters away from people, then I'm safe. I don't have to use a mask. Okay, this is again, for example, a discourse in the head of one person. So one person says, "I don't need a mask as long as I stay 2 meters away from a person, because up until now that's what I've been doing, and I didn't got COVID-19, so that's my rule." And another person says, "Well, I have to use a mask because the masks protect me, and I'm pretty sure the mask will protect me 100%, so I can even hug another person with the mask because the masks protect me." And those two people are behaving in two very different ways because they've made sense to themselves of what the threat is, right? And that's a completely different set of thinking that you need to take into consideration when making your decisions. And another very prominent sociological effect is what we call the covidiot, or in other words, them and us. There's, the Israeli population in general is one with lots of rifts inside. In terms of religion, Jews versus non-Jews, secular versus religious, even gender-based. There's plentiful of rifts in the Israeli society and also elsewhere, not just in Israel. But to add on upon that, on top of that, another kind of rift of them and us is really not what we need right now. Them is in the eyes of the beholder, right? So if you are an anti-vaxxer, then everyone else is crazy and weird and poor judgment and disinformed. And if you are on the opposite side, then that's exactly what you think about the anti-vaxxers. And that just creates more tension in the society, more conflicts in the society. People are referred to as covidiots. That's the easy way out. Just calling another person a covidiot doesn't solve the problem. We need to understand the way people perceive the risk. We need to understand what makes them tick. We need to understand how we can change their discourse and their way of thinking if we want them to engage in a behavior that is in the benefit of all. And the way to do that, as I said before, is through a discourse that puts focus on optimism, empowerment, and social norms, the togetherness instead of them and us. So what are the next steps? We need to identify what are those unwanted behavior. We need to understand what is that people do that we would like to change. And we also need to explain them. We need to try and understand the psychology behind unwanted behaviors of people during pandemics, during disasters and emergencies. We need to ask ourselves, can those behaviors be predicted? And if so, how can we propose, or what mitigation solutions can we propose to overcome them, right? And finally, draw some conclusions for principles on how we should manage such pandemics in the future. All of these questions are open questions for you to think about. I don't have all of the solutions. There's a lot of research that needs to be done here, and COVID-19 is a great opportunity to make all of this research, but many of these questions remain open-ended to be discovered later on. Finally, the motto of our program, those who don't learn from the past are condemned to repeat it. We have to learn from the past. We have to learn from our mistakes. And a good place to start is by understanding people and the way they perceive risks and react to disaster rescues.